I'm here with good friend Stephen McAlpine, consultant, author, blogger, and all round good guy. And Stephen, I noticed in a recent article you argue that in pursuit of transcendent experiences through architecture and liturgy, we've missed the fact that God's people are the thin space. And I'd like to explore that thin space idea with you. And how does that reshape the way pastors approach Sunday gatherings and also the formation of discipleship in a community of faith? How does it reshape that?
Look, I love the idea of architecture, so don't get me wrong. I love the idea of what church looks like. But very interesting that the desire for transcendence has come back among young people who've lacked it. But when you read something like Ephesians 2, it compares, well, it doesn't quite compare, but Paul talks about God's people being the temple uh,
Mm.
in which the Holy Spirit dwells as we gather and are built up to be a temple in the Lord. And in one sense, that's the people of God gathered are the thin space between the transcendent and the material world. And it's an exciting venture. It doesn't mean don't have a great building with beautiful things that look transcendent, but it does mean what does it mean to focus on God's people being that space?
I think it's a fascinating article, and I do love your writing. You just have a way with words that I wish wish I had your gift. I'm a far more pragmatic type writer, but I love your way of words. And in the article, and look, I've got a link to all of Stephen's content and material in the description. Make sure you connect with him online, but also with his writings. You contrast in this article the ancient temple of Artemis with Paul's vision of believers as God's temple. What do you think of the practical implications for pastors and church leaders who are tempted to invest heavily in buildings and feel like they have to versus investing in people and relationships? It's a tension that's probably goes back to the first century, to be honest. But what are the implications for churches in that tension that they feel?
Well, I think one of the tensions is you want to run things well, you want your building good and things like that. But if you have issues between believers, you're actually operating in that space, which is a transcendent space. It's not a pragmatic. You might pragmatically go, well, I'll park Mrs. Smith 500 seats away from Mrs. Jones, and that'll solve the problem in this space. But in the transcendent space, that's a very different thing. If these people, Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones, are both building blocks of a spiritual temple, you might want to know how to resolve conflict as a leader. I think that's going to be a critical issue.
Mm.
And I think down the line that resolving conflict in church, dealing well with people who are part of the building, is there's an EQ level to that, but there's a spiritual EQ thing to that as well. There's a deep issue
Mm.
of prayer. I'm praying about a temple who are a people. That's going to be important, I think. So, how you navigate conflict in church ramps up when you realize that we are the temple in that sense.
Feeling stuck as a church leader? Growing your church doesn't have to be overwhelming. The Hub gives you step by step roadmaps to grow a healthy church in just 20 minutes a day. Join the hundreds of church leaders who found their breakthrough by accessing my 4 decades of ministry experience, which delivers genuine results. Start your free 14-day trial today at growahealthychurch.com/hub. Yeah, and I think dealing with conflict in church is pretty normative for all pastors, and how to navigate that and how to deal with that, I think is important. What are some ideas around navigating that conflict while protecting that unity of God's people? Because you want people to be in love with one another, as it were. You want people to be protecting that unity and caring for one another. What's some ideas of how church leaders can navigate sorting out that conflict?
I think one of the things is obviously going to come from the platform. You're going to have to be the kind of person that preaches about it, about the thin space. And that's not something we do as well as we used to do, I think, or perhaps we could do in the future. And the other thing, too, is I think leadership really needs to model in its leadership structures how you deal with conflict. I mean, you know it because we both have done these things where you have to be parachuted into conflict situations to resolve them, where you go, if I pull those threads back a little bit, it could have been solved back here by something, but it never got resolved. It got dampened down. And don't underestimate the fact that the evil one also doesn't mind a bit of conflict in church. And if he operates in the thin space too, and the prince of the power of the air, he has a vested interest in the invisible realm damaging the visible realm, I think.
Mm,
That's the Bible would say that. So I think from the platform and in the leadership structures and how you teach, but also keeping an eye on the kind of leaders you put in place, you really want people with what I call sort of high EQ glasses that can scan the room and read people well. Because the last thing you need is that person who's good at something, but they always cause conflict. I think
mm.
you've got to say to them, cannot be dealing with people. That's what I would say.
I think that's brilliant, and I think you're right. Who you put into positions of authority and responsibility in your church, they need to be high EQ. They need to be able to understand how relationships work, and also how to do that. What one of my friends called carefrontation. You care enough to actually confront someone when they're in conflict. Explain that phrase, the thin space. I remember reading it in the article and thinking, I've never heard that phrase before. Explain how you look at that phrase and what it means to you.
Well, as a recently, and for most of my adult life, being in the Reformed Christian tradition, I did have Pentecostal background experiences, and there was something about the fact that when God's people meet, and Paul says it in 1 Corinthians as well, God's really among you. When things happen, um, we've lost the idea that the invisible realm is as close as it is to us, because the secular frame says this is all there is, and though Christians we don't believe that this is all there is, we kind of think there's a big gap where God's way out there, and really all it is that on the last day in particular, God will peel back the reality and you'll see the thin space become the reality, what's
Wow.
behind it. And so, as Christians, we lean into that and believe we're waiting for that invisible reality to be our visible reality. But at the moment, you live between these two. That's what the whole thing about the Holy Spirit is, that we are in step with the Spirit and the Spirit was within us. John Calvin, the great reformer, said that it's the Holy Spirit who connects us to the very throne room of God. And that's the thinnest of spaces, I think. And I think we've got to lean into that and rejoice in it, I think. And young people find that quite attractive. That's why Pentecostal churches have been booming with young people, because they
Mm.
want something that says there's a thin space and God somehow meets us in between these two places.
That's awesome, and we've talked some months ago about that growing hunger amongst young adults, and especially young adult men, looking for that transcendent worship experience. Are you continuing to see that in your travels around Australia and your connections around the world?
Yeah, two things I think. They're looking for historical connection. So they're looking for
Mm,
horizontal and they're looking for vertical. So they don't just want a cheap experience, they want something that leans in long. And I've noticed pastors coming up to me saying, well, whether there's a quiet revival or there's not, I've got a bunch of young men saying, I want to get baptized. You go, well, how did you come to
mm.
that decision? Couldn't you just be a curious onlooker for a while? Nope, I want to get baptized. Out of nothing. That's YouTube for you, I tell you.
I think it
Watching
is an
all,
amazing time.
yeah,
Sorry, go on.
yeah. Well, watching YouTube videos. Wes Huff, for example, the apologist,
Mm,
who'll be in Queensland next week at a big Pentecostal church that I'll be at, and
mm.
he's got 3,000 people going to that event. And there's something going on among those young guys. Mm.
I think there is. I think it's a fabulous time to be alive. And also, I think it's a fabulous time to be a church leader. And you may be in a smaller church and you're thinking, well, I'm not sure if I'm seeing all that. But I think keep your eyes open over the next 3 to 5 years. I think we are in a space of a move of God that we will see the evidence of that over the next 3 to 5 years. And Steve and I previously talked about the growing trend of young men coming to church. Check out this video because it'll give you some more insights into what I think is a huge trend, Stephen. And I was talking recently to Aussie Dave Adamson, and he's hearing exactly the same thing in his connections in Australia and globally. And thanks for talking to us today about the thin space where the community of Jesus followers live. Thanks, mate.
Well, it's great to chat with you, mate.